Hello everyone, welcome back to chapter 10.2.2, and today we're going to solve more equations using something called fraction busters, also known as fraction blasters. So today you guys are going to learn about, actually you have learned about it before because I've talked about it in class, but how to get rid of our fractions to make our equations easier. Okay, so that's our objective today, is how can we make the equation easier for us to solve before we actually attempt to start solving them. So in the previous lesson, you guys learned a powerful new method to help solve complicated equations, to rewrite the equation first to create a simpler equivalent equation. Today you will continue to solve new complicated equations and will focus specifically on equations with fractions. As you solve these new problems, look for ways to connect today's work with what you have learned previously. So real quickly, on our first equation, or first problem here, 10-34, we have an equation with fractions, right? So part A says to multiply each term by 6. What happens? Well, if you notice, if we multiply everything by 6, right, it will get rid of the first denominator of 6, but it doesn't cancel out with the 8. So that's going to be a problem, right? We will have fractions remaining. So in order to address this, what are you guys going to do? Right? What's the best way to figure this out? So how can we change our result from part A so that no problems will remain? So if you're not sure at this point what to multiply by, try to figure it out. In fact, maybe pause the video right now and see what you can come up with, and come back when you're done. Alright, so at this point you're thinking, well, I can't multiply it by 6 and I can't multiply it by 8. So the best thing to do, if you haven't figured out by now, is to multiply it by the lowest common denominator. Okay, so between a 6 and an 8, you're going to get 6 times 8 is 48, right? But 48 is not the lowest common denominator. You could multiply it by 48. It just makes things a little bit more work than you actually need to do. So the best number to multiply these terms are going to be 24, right? Because 24 is the lowest common denominator between a 6 and an 8. So I'm going to multiply every single term by 24. Okay, so once I multiply it by 24, I can start canceling now. So 6 goes into 24 4 times, 8 goes into 24 3 times. Okay, so essentially I have 4 times x, which is 4x, minus 3 times 5, which is 15, equals 4 times 24, which is, 96? Okay, and then we start solving for x here. Add 15 on both sides. I'm going to get 4x equals, what's that, 11? Ooh, that doesn't seem right. And then divide both sides by 4. And 11 over 4 is what we come up with. Also known as 27 3/4. Okay, so that's just a brief introduction or refresher on how we solve an equation with fractions. Like I said, we've done that in class before, but if you've forgotten how to do it, there it is again. What I want to do now is we're going to go to the next problem, 10-35, and we've got the same situation. It says to solve the equation first by finding an equivalent equation without fractions. Okay, so go ahead and do the fraction busters method, see what you come up with. Okay, so you should have figured out that your lowest common denominator was going to be 6. So we multiply everything by 6, and essentially I canceled out my denominators. In my first one I got 3 goes into 6 2 times, so I have 2 times 5x, which is 10x, and then 2 goes into 6 3 times, so 3 times 15 is 45, and then 2 goes into 6 3 times, so I have 3 times 5 is 15. And essentially after that it's just a two-step equation. We solve for x, and x equals -3. Okay, so we're going to go to our next problem now. 10-36. We've got 4 different equations here. So it says work with your team to solve each of the equations that contains no fractions, or basically fraction blast them. So obviously you guys aren't working in teams, so at this point I want you guys to attempt problem A. When you're go ahead and attempt this problem, pause the video. When you're done, come back and check your answers. Alright, so this one's, we have 3 different denominators. So between a 4, a 6, and a 3, our lowest common denominator will be a 12. So I multiplied everything by 12 and got x equals 8. Alright, go ahead and attempt problem B. Pause the video, come back when you're done. Alright, so this one requires a little bit more work because you figure out there's only one denominator, so we're going to multiply everything by that denominator of x, and as a result we're going to get a negative 2x squared there, and then on the right side of 3x. So essentially we have a quadratic equation. So I'm moving everything to the right side just so I can get rid of that negative 2x and turn it into a positive 2x by adding, or excuse me, 2x squared. And then I'm going to get rid of that 5 by subtracting 5 on both sides. So essentially I have this quadratic equation, and I decided to factor because I identified that it was relatively easy to factor. And I got my 2 binomials of x minus 1 and then 2x plus 5. When I solved it, I got x equals 1 and x equals negative 5 halves. Okay, so we have 2 problems left on 10-36. I want you guys to pause the video and attempt these last 2 equations and come back when you're done. Alright, so for problem C, you should have gotten x equals negative 10. And the common denominator here is going to be a 21. So you guys notice I multiplied everything by 21. And because it's a binomial at the very top in the numerator of the fraction, this I have a 7 as my is what 21 divided by 3 is, right? So because that 7 is what's left over, I'm going to have to distribute it because there's technically parentheses around that binomial. So I got to make sure I multiply that 7 into the negative 2x and the positive 1. And that's how I get those 2 terms. Okay, and the same thing with the next term, right? 7 goes into 21 3 times, so it's going to be that negative 3, because it's a minus, right? So negative 3 times 3, or times x is negative 3x, and then negative 3 times 3 is negative 9. And so if you didn't get what I got, please pause the video or backtrack it so that you could see the steps clearly and see what I did to get x equals negative 10. Okay, and then problem D, the same deal. The lowest common denominator is going to be x, and because those 2 x's canceled, I'm technically distributing a 1, right? So I just have 1 times x is x, 1 times 3 is 3. Or if you want to think of it, the x's on the bottom and top just canceled out, and so what I have remaining is just x plus 3. And then x times 2 is 2x, and then on the right side again, I'm canceling out my x's, and so I just have an x plus 5. And you start solving for x, you get x equals 1. Alright, so the next question, 10-37, says look at the problems in B and D from the previous example. Okay, before solving, could you tell what values of x were definitely not allowed? Okay, so for B and D, those 2 problems right there, what can't x be is basically what it's asking. Okay, so pause the video, think about it, and unpause it when you think you know the answer. Alright, so it's pretty straightforward. Because this is an equation with your x variable in your denominator, whenever you're solving for equations, you can't ever have a 0 be in your denominator because it would then be undefined. So, and this question is basically asking what can't x be? X cannot equal 0. So it could be anything but 0, right? Well, technically not anything, but your answers that we got cannot be 0. All right, and then I believe this is going to be our last problem. Yes, so today's lesson is very short. 10-38 says to solve the equations by first changing each equation to a simpler equivalent equation. Check your solutions. And then, are there any values of the variable that are not allowed? Right. So go ahead and pause the video. I want you guys to solve these. Why don't you solve A and B first, and then come back when you're done. Okay. So pause the video, solve A and B, come right back. Alright, so there are your results for problems A and B. For problem A, I've divided every term by 50, and to simplify everything, I was able to bring it down to get that trinomial, and from there I factored using the zero product property. I got x equals -3 and -1. Then for problem B, the lowest common denominator, it's a little bit trickier, it's going to be a 9a. So I multiplied everything by 9a, and eventually was able to pull everything on one side, and I got that trinomial, which factored perfectly into this, basically a perfect square trinomial. I got the quantity a minus 3 quantity squared equals 0, and if I set each one of those equal to 0, I solved for a and got a equals 3. And also the question said, are there any variables that are not allowed? Any values of the variable that are not allowed? And because a is in your denominator here, like I said earlier, your denominator cannot be 0, therefore a cannot be 0. Okay? Alright, at this point, I want you guys to attempt the last two problems, C and D, and see what you guys come up with. Alright, go ahead and pause the video and come back when you guys are done with this. Okay, so for problem C, to get rid, or to make the equation simpler to solve, you would basically get rid of the decimals, right? And because you only having to move over one place, the best thing to do is just to multiply everything by 10. So once you multiplied everything by 10, you got rid of your decimals, things are much easier to solve, and you should get m equals 20. For problem D, the lowest common denominator is going to be 12, so you're going to multiply every single term by 12, and essentially you get to reduce your fractions, and you're going to be at this step. At that point, you're just going to solve for x. You get x equals 6/13. Okay, so that's pretty much all today's lesson's about. You're continuing to learn different shortcuts, different things you can use to make life a little bit easier when you're solving these equations. So as a closure activity, I want you guys to write down three different things you can do to the equation, obviously depending on the three types of equations you might get, but list 3 things that you could do to make solving the equations a little bit easier. Okay, and that wraps it up for today, guys. If you have any questions, please let me know. Shoot me an email. Otherwise, I will talk to you guys soon. Have a great day. Bye, guys.